This recording is for Biology Module 11. It's the second half of Module 11, dealing with the invertebrates. And in this video, we will do phylum Annelida, phylum Nematoda, phylum Platyhelminthes, and lastly, we will do phylum Mollusca. Okay, so let's start with phylum Annelida. And this phylum, it is the segmented worms. And specifically, we will look at the earthworm. And so during our lab time, we will be dissecting earthworms. So earthworms are divided into segments, as illustrated on this figure. So you can see the segments here. They have an anterior end and a posterior end. The anterior end is more pointed and includes the mouth, and then the posterior end doesn't have the pointed end to it like the mouth does. And then dividing the anterior and the posterior ends is a structure that is called the clitellum. You see that here. And it actually it's closer to the anterior end than it is to the posterior end. And so it's a swelling that is typically between segments like 31 and 37 is where you will find the clitellum. The anterior end also will tend to be a redder, kind of a darker color than the other end. The earthworm contains two different types of muscle. They have a circular muscle layer and also a longitudinal muscle layer. And it is these two muscle layers that allow their movement. So basically what they do is when they contract the circular layer, that makes the worm kind of long and thin. And then when they contract the longitudinal layer, that is when they get short and thick. So basically they alternate contracting these two layers, so they stretch out and then they get short and thick, and in that way then they are able to move. And the reason that they can move is they anchor their posterior end. So they have these kind of hair-like structures that are called, they're kind of like bristles, I guess. They're called setae. And they use those setae to anchor the posterior end, so that when the muscles contract, then the anterior end is able to move forward. So it's this alternation of these two muscle layers that allows them to move like that. Again, if we go back to our figure of the earthworm, The earthworm is the first organism that we have looked at so far that has what we call a complete digestive system. And by that we mean that the digestive system starts with the mouth, and then it's a long tube that ends in the anus. So the earthworm takes soil into the mouth, and then it does that. It does that by a sucking motion. So it takes the soil into the mouth by sucking, and then from there it goes into the pharynx. And then it goes into the crop. And once it gets to the crop, it's kind of stored for a while. And then from the crop, it will proceed into the gizzard. And what happens in the gizzard is that it gets ground up. So it gets broken up into small pieces. Then from the gizzard, it goes into the small intestine. And in the small intestine is where digestion continues, but this is also where nutrients get absorbed into the bloodstream. So the nutrients move from the small intestine into the blood in the small intestine. That's the same as in our digestive system. The small intestine is where the majority of absorption of nutrients into the blood occurs. And then lastly, then from the small intestine, then it goes to the anus, and waste is eliminated through the anus. So anything that, once the nutrients are taken out, the waste is eliminated through the anus. So let's look then at our figure. And so you can follow the digestive system all the way through. So here it starts at the mouth, and with that sucking motion, it pulls, in a sucking motion of both the mouth and the pharynx, it pulls the dirt into it. Then I guess I didn't mention the esophagus, but there's a long tube called the esophagus. Then it goes into the crop, the gizzard, and then this section is actually, then we get into the small intestine, which ends up being a very large section that goes all the way back out to the anus. So it is a complete digestive system, very similar to, in terms of its parts, very similar to the digestive system in a human. So most of the waste gets eliminated through the anus. However, there is a structure that is called nephridia. And these structures are these would be similar to kidneys. And what these nephridia do is that they push waste out through structures that are called nephridiophores. And in every segment of the earthworm except segments 1 and 3, and the last segment, there are these nephridiopores. So it's another way of eliminating waste. A nephron is a functional unit of the kidney, so these would be analogous to kidneys in a human. Let's look at our figure, and let's see, I guess they don't have the nephridiopores on here, but the waste is pushed out through the nephridia into these openings that are called nephridiopores. So the earthworms, they consume the soil because the soil is full of nutrients, and so they are able to extract the nutrients out of that. Okay, now let's look at the respiratory and circulatory systems. So respiration and circulation. So the earthworm need to get food, and they need to get oxygen transported throughout the body. They do not have a heart. And what they do have is they have two main blood vessels. They have the dorsal blood vessel, and they have a ventral blood vessel. The dorsal blood vessel the dorsal blood vessel is the one that returns blood. The blood gets carried back to the heart. Actually, not back to the heart, but back to, we'll see in a minute, back to the aortic arches. And then it is the ventral blood vessels that carry blood away from the aortic arch. So these two blood vessels are connected with each other by these structures that are called aortic arches. So the blood is carried, blood leaves the aortic arches by the ventral blood vessel, and then throughout the body, oxygen and nutrients are removed from the blood, and then the blood gets returned to the aortic arches through the dorsal blood vessel. Okay, so here's our figure again. Okay, so these are these structures that are called the aortic arches right here. Make those a different color so we can see them. I'll make them blue. Okay, so see, these are the aortic arches. And when we do our dissection, we should be they're very small, and they look like little fingers. So can't always see them. There can be up to 10 or 12 of them. We hope to be able to see a few of them when we do our dissection. So blood leaves these aortic arches through the ventral blood vessel, and then the blood gets returned through the dorsal blood vessel. So these blood vessels have a connection down at the posterior end, and then from each of these blood vessels, there are branches of vessels where the tissues or the organs are supplied with oxygen and nutrients. So as I said earlier, the blood picks up the nutrients from the intestines, and then the blood vessels transport it throughout the body. Now, besides nutrients getting picked up through the intestines, the earthworm is also dependent on blood, or dependent on oxygen coming through its skin. So the skin of an earthworm is covered with, the skin is covered with a thin layer that is called the cuticle. And that cuticle is wet, and it allows oxygen to move into the earthworm, and it also allows carbon dioxide, which is waste, to be moved out. And so, and it's critical that this cuticle remain wet. So if the earthworm dries out, then the cuticle is no longer able to absorb oxygen, and the earthworm will die. If, on the other hand, if there's too much, if it's too wet, and the soil gets too saturated, then the water replaces the oxygen, and there's no oxygen to be absorbed through the skin, and then the earthworm can also die in that situation. So they breathe through their skin. It's a very they have a very thin skin, and it's covered in a cuticle, and that allows them to breathe. Okay, let's look at their nervous system. So the earthworm doesn't really have a true brain. What they do have is they have two masses of nerve tissue that are called ganglia. So these are up in the anterior end, and they basically function as the brain for an earthworm. So they can respond to things like touch and taste and sound. And then from these nerve tissues, there is a large ventral cord, which would be similar to your spinal cord. That large ventral cord runs along the bottom of the earthworm. And it's pretty, we can usually find it, almost always can find it when we do a dissection, because it's a thin, kind of white, shiny cord that runs along the bottom. So the ganglia and the ventral cord can sense things like touch and sound and light. They also are able to sense when there's too much water, and then it would signal the earthworm to surface so that they don't drown as a result of too much water. So let's look at that picture again. So here you can see these two ganglia, these two bundles of nerve tissue near the anterior end, and then this ventral cord that runs on the bottom of the earthworm. Okay, while we are here, let me go ahead and show you a couple other structures that we'll talk about now. One of those structures is called a seminal vesicle, and that is where sperm, so the seminal vesicles are where sperm are made, and the seminal receptacles are where it's stored. So both of these have to do with sperm. Oh, I'll write it up here. And then then you have the ovary and the oviduct, and it is in the ovary that the eggs are made, and then they are stored in the oviduct. Okay, so the ovary and the oviduct then are associated with the eggs. Okay, so keep those two structures in mind. So in terms of reproduction for earthworms, earthworms are hermaphrodites. And what that means is that they produce both eggs and sperm. So they have both the seminal vesicles and the seminal receptacles, and they also have the ovaries and the oviduct. However, earthworms cannot mate with themselves. Now, there are some hermaphrodites that under certain conditions will mate with themselves, but earthworms cannot mate with themselves. So the sperm from one earthworm has to fertilize the eggs from another earthworm. And here is how that happens. So actually, let's go back to this picture again. So in an earthworm, we would find both the male and the female parts within an earthworm because they are hermaphrodites. But as I said, they can't mate with themselves, so the sperm from one needs to fertilize the eggs from another. Okay, so here's what happens in terms of how they mate. As I said, the sperm are stored in the seminal receptacles. Actually, they're stored in the seminal vesicles. And in the female, the eggs are stored in the oviducts. Okay, so what happens when they reproduce is that two worms will attach to each other, and they'll attach so that they'll attach from opposite ends, so that one's head will be pointing one way and the other head will be pointing the other way, and they will form around each other. Around themselves, they will form a structure that is called a slime tube. And when they form that slime tube, they will exchange sperm. So what happens is that the sperm from one goes into the seminal receptacle of the other, and vice versa. Okay, so the sperm go from the seminal vesicles where they were stored into the seminal receptacle of the other. And then once they have exchanged their sperm, then they'll separate from each other. And then what happens is that a cocoon forms around the clitellum of each earthworm. So a cocoon forms around the clitellum, and then what happens is the earthworm kind of backs out of that cocoon, and as the cocoon passes over the oviduct, then the eggs get fertilized. Then eggs are fertilized. Okay, remember those are they're being fertilized by sperm from the other earthworm, the earthworm that it mated with. So again, let's take a look at our picture. So it's this clitellum. The cocoon kind of forms around this clitellum, and then when the earthworm backs through that clitellum, the cocoon around the clitellum, then the sperm that are stored in the seminal receptacles will fertilize the eggs that are formed in the oviduct, and then they'll completely free themselves, and then the eggs then will develop within this cocoon. The fertilized eggs will develop within this cocoon, and a few weeks after that, they will break out of their cocoon, and you have small earthworms. Okay, so that's how reproduction occurs within the earthworm. I think that's all we need to say about the earthworms and about phylum Annelida. We'll get to see as many of those parts as possible when we do our dissections. Okay, so now let's go on to phylum Platyhelminthes. Sometimes we just refer to these as the helminths, but the full word is Platyhelminthes. And these are the flatworms. And many of them live in fresh water. And one that we're going to look at first that is a freshwater Platyhelminthes is called the planarian. And the reason the planarian is interesting is that they are able to reproduce by regeneration. So they can reproduce sexually, and they are hermaphrodites. So they can reproduce sexually, and again they don't reproduce with themselves. They have to exchange sperm with a mate. But then another way that they can reproduce is by regeneration. And so regeneration means that if you cut them in half, the head part will grow a tail, and the tail part will grow a head. And in fact, you can cut them into 5 or 6 pieces, and each of those pieces will grow into, you can cut one into 5 or 6 pieces, and each piece will grow into a full planarian. The other thing that you can do is you can take a planarian, and if you take a blade and make a cut through its head, it will grow 2 heads. So they're a very interesting organism, and I have a video to show you It's not in English, but this is one, it's the only one I could find that was short enough to see what I wanted to show you without having to sit for a long period of time to look at it. So it's about 2 minutes. We probably won't watch the full 2 minutes, but I wanted you to see regeneration in planaria.
ここからなんです。プラナリアの体を半分に切ってしまっても頭の部分はそれだけで生きていき、尻尾の部分もそれだけで生きていけるのです。でも本当にすごいのはここからなんです。ここからです。体を5つのパーツに切りバラバラに分けても5つの小さな体たちはそれぞれがそれぞれで生き続けていけるのです。
なんで顔ができるの？
でも本当にすごいのはこれからなんです。尻尾を切られた頭だけのパーツから再び尻尾が生えてくるのです。そして時間とともにその長さを伸ばし再び元の大きさにまで戻ってしまうのです。そしてなんと頭を切られた尻尾だけのパーツからは頭が生え、そして目まで再生されるのです。気を追うごとに体